They called it the Empire of Light, a civilization of gold, poetry, and divine kingship. But beneath the marble of Persepolis ran another empire, one ruled by silence, blood, and desire. Here, pleasure was not passion, but power. Women were currency, faith was a mask, and every sigh in the night paid tribute to the great king's dominion. Historians wrote of Persia's conquests, its wisdom, its glory. None wrote of what was hidden beneath, the markets of flesh, the temples of sin, and the broken souls whose bodies built an empire. Tonight, their silence finally speaks. In the heart of Persepolis, sunlight poured across carved pillars like molten gold. The city was a monument to divine kingship, perfect geometry shaped by human hands that no one remembered. For every artist who inscribed the king's glory, 100 slaves died nameless in the dust. But deeper still, below the courtyards and feasting halls, lay a second empire, one no tablet recorded. It began as rumor, whispers of a network beneath the royal quarter, chambers perfumed with incense and guarded by silence. Men spoke of them only in shadows, the houses where the empire's most secret trade thrived. Not gold, not wine, flesh. The Persian court called them the sanctuaries of Achaemenid, places where beauty honored the goddess of love. But these sanctuaries were brothels of the elite, masked as holy institutions to protect the reputation of those who owned them. Slaves captured from every corner of the empire, from the coasts of Ionia, the valleys of Bactria, and the frozen lands of Sogdia, were trained to please, to submit, and to forget. Each dawn began with discipline. The women were washed in scented water and painted with crushed minerals from distant mines. Tutors taught them the gestures of affection, not to feel, but to perform. The priests dictated posture, gaze, and silence. Obedience became survival. Even their names were forbidden. A girl might once have been Parisa, Layla, or Samira. Now she was only a number, a face in the line of offerings to the king's guests. To the nobles, this trade was not sin but art. They saw no cruelty, only ceremony. The empire's power, they said, demanded beauty to reflect its divinity. And so beauty itself became enslaved. The priests spoke of purity through devotion, convincing the captives that their degradation was a holy rite. The girls prayed to a goddess who had abandoned them, to a sky that no longer answered. Once a year, during the festival of fertility, the highest-ranking courtesans were paraded through Persepolis. Draped in gold, they appeared divine to the crowd. Yet behind the painted faces lay fear, each step echoing with memories of the night they were taken, the family they would never see again. The spectators called it spectacle. The slaves called it judgment. For the king, it was control. Every body sold, every secret whispered, was another thread binding the empire together. Lust was a weapon sharper than the soldier's blade. It conquered without battle, ruled without rebellion. But in the hidden corridors beneath the royal palace, among the women who had forgotten their own reflections, a faint tremor of thought began to stir. A question no one dared to speak aloud. What happens when beauty turns to ashes? For now, the empire above glittered, unaware that its brightest jewel was already cracking from within. The trade of flesh had given Persia its illusion of perfection. Yet even the most perfect stone fractures when its foundation is built on screams. And far away, beyond the walls of Persepolis, another caravan of chained girls was approaching. Among them, a young captive from Sogdia who would one day set the empire aflame. She was born where the wind never stopped, the valleys of Sogdia, where the mountains bled snow into the earth. Her people traded silk and stories, not war. But Persia's armies came not for trade nor peace. They came for tribute. When the soldiers arrived, the village was silent by sunrise. The men were chained, the old left to die in their burned homes. The young, especially the beautiful, were taken. Among them was a girl with eyes the color of twilight. Her name was Nara, The march south lasted 20 days. Chains rubbed her skin raw, dust burned her throat. The soldiers did not speak to her. She was not human in their eyes. At night, she heard the sobs of others, Ionian, Median, Bactrian girls, each whispering in a language no one else understood. When one tried to escape, her body was left hanging from a post, as the others were forced to watch. That was how obedience was taught. When they reached Ecbatana, Nara saw the empire for the first time. Gold domes shimmered against the desert sky. The air smelled of dates and blood. She was led through the gates of the slave market, an amphitheater of misery where buyers examined flesh, like merchants inspecting gems. The auction began with laughter. One by one, girls were displayed, their origins announced like exotic trophies. Daughter of an Ionian merchant, born from a Median concubine, captured from the plains of Sardia. Nara's turn came. She was forced to kneel, her hair pulled back, her face painted. The crowd murmured approval. A man in white robes lifted her chin. He smiled, the kind of smile that promised pain. He bought her without a word. Nara was taken to a house unlike any she had seen, marble floors, brass mirrors, and an odor of roses masking the stench of fear. The women there did not speak. They moved with grace, their silence rehearsed, their smiles deliberate. One older woman, her eyes hollow, whispered only once, "Forget your name if you want to live." That night, the transformation began. Her clothes were burned, her body scrubbed until her skin bled. The mistress of the house, a priestess of Anahita, oversaw the ritual. She poured scented oil over Nara's head and declared, "You are now reborn in service of the goddess." Nara wanted to scream, to remind them she had a mother, a name, a soul. But the words turned to dust in her mouth. The priestess smiled at her silence. "Good," she said. "The goddess loves quiet devotion." Days bled into weeks. Nara learned how to walk, how to smile, how to hide pain behind her eyes. Her body no longer belonged to her. It was a mask, an instrument, a gift to those who paid for the illusion of love. And yet, when she looked into the polished copper mirror one night, she could not recognize herself. The girl from Sardia had vanished. In her place stood a creature shaped by fear and survival. Outside, the empire celebrated its glory, songs, banners, gold. But in the chamber where Nara slept, her heart whispered something forbidden. "One day, the gods will remember us." It was not rebellion yet, only a thought. But in a world built on obedience, even a thought was dangerous. The girl from Sardia had entered the empire's heart, and in time she would become its disease. In the high city of Ecbatana stood a temple that reeked of holiness and perfume. The priests of Anahita called it the House of Purification. But within its polished walls, purity was only a story told to ease the conscience of men. Here, Nara was taken after her training, not as a slave but as an offering. The priest who oversaw her initiation was called Azareth. His beard was oiled, his hands soft, his eyes void of mercy. He greeted the new girls not with compassion, but with ritual precision, as if inspecting sacrificial lambs. They were told that the goddess demanded their service, that through them, men would be cleansed of their earthly sins. "You are the river through which impurity flows away," Azareth intoned, his voice echoing against the temple's stone vaults. "You are sacred vessels. You do not belong to yourselves." The ritual began at dusk. The air filled with the thick sweetness of myrrh and rose oil. Naked flames flickered along the altar, where statues of the goddess smiled in silent mockery. The girls were bathed in scented water, their bodies painted with blue lines meant to symbolize divinity. Nara stood among them, trembling, her mind screaming against the beauty of the horror around her. When her turn came, Azareth placed his hand upon her head. "The goddess sees you," he murmured. "You are now the path to her mercy." He anointed her with oil, his fingers tracing the symbols of fertility along her skin, the same gestures used in the prayers of war. That night, Nura served her first pilgrim. He was a nobleman returning from Babylon. Eager to cleanse himself, before presenting tribute to the king, he entered the temple chamber with offerings of gold and pomegranates, whispering a prayer to Anahita as if the goddess herself awaited him. Nara was told to kneel and smile. Every movement was rehearsed, every sound orchestrated. The act was called worship. It was, in truth, desecration dressed in silk. When it was over, the nobleman left satisfied, a man reborn in his own eyes. The priest collected the gold and offered a blessing. Nara sat in silence, feeling the perfume cling to her skin like a curse. She understood then that holiness was the empire's greatest lie. Days blurred into one another. The temple bells mark each hour of devotion, each body offered in the name of purity. The priest spoke of balance and divine harmony while counting coins in hidden ledgers. The scent of flowers could no longer mask the rot beneath. One evening, while cleaning the altar, Nara noticed something carved into the stone, faint lines. Almost erased, the goddess weeps for her daughters. It was the first trace of rebellion she had ever seen. Someone before her had known the truth and dared to leave a mark. From that moment, the temple changed for her. Every prayer became hypocrisy, every ritual a performance of power. The priest's words began to sound hollow, their piety absurd. Beneath her silence, something began to awaken, not hope, not yet, but awareness. Azareth saw it too. "You must remember," he warned. "The goddess watches even your thoughts." But the goddess, Nara realized, had long turned away. Only men were watching now. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the perfume, beneath the painted devotion, Nara began to plan what no priest could ever purify: the thought of disobedience. The temple of Anahita was only one chamber in the empire's vast network of worship. Beyond its marble halls, caravans of silence crossed the desert, carrying what the king called divine gifts. They were not gold or spice. They were girls. The collector came for them at night. His name was Achaemenid, a cousin to the king, born of royal blood and rotted by privilege. He wore robes woven in Tyre, his fingers heavy with rings that glittered like small suns. When he arrived, even the priests bowed. For Achaemenid was not merely a man, he was the emperor's shadow, the keeper of desires too shameful for daylight. They called him the collector of virgins, though no record dared explain why. He claimed to serve the goddess, gathering her brides for sacred unions in distant temples. But the truth, whispered only among servants, was far darker. The girls he took were never seen again. When he entered Ecbatana, the temple bells fell silent. Azareth greeted him with incense and fear, while the priestesses lined up in trembling rows. His eyes slid over them like a merchant assessing livestock. "Too thin," he muttered. "Too old." His gaze stopped at Nara. "This one," he said. "She has the look of devotion." That night, Nara was chosen. The priest told her it was an honor, that the goddess had called her to serve in the royal sanctum. But when the guards led her away, she noticed their swords drawn, not bowed. Honors were never guarded by blades. They rode for days through scorched lands, past shrines and burned villages. Nara learned that each province paid its tax in beauty, one virgin for every 10 harvests. Achaemenid called it tribute to Anahita, but the laughter of his men betrayed the truth. When they reached Persepolis, the city shone like a fever dream. Towers of white stone caught the sun, and banners fluttered with the symbol of the lion and sun, power wrapped in perfection. But beneath the splendor lay something foul. Beneath every festival, a silence of vanished daughters. The collector led Nara to a palace that was not on any map. Its walls were painted with scenes of weddings, hundreds of women kneeling before faceless gods. The air was sweet, too sweet, like rotting fruit under perfume. Inside were other girls, pale, quiet, adorned in gold chains instead of veils. Some smiled emptily, as if their souls had learned to leave their bodies. When Nara asked one where they were, she only whispered, "Nowhere. We are nowhere." The days became ritual. Each girl was washed, perfumed, and brought before noblemen who came under the guise of worship. The collector watched, ensuring no defiance, no tears. "Your silence is your devotion," he said. "The goddess listens only to quiet hearts." Nara obeyed, but her silence was no longer submission. She listened, learned, remembered. She saw the secret tunnels where girls were taken and never returned. She memorized the guards' faces, the priests' prayers, the way Achaemenid locked the golden doors each night. One evening, as torches flickered over the marble floor, she caught her reflection in a polished bronze mirror. Her face looked older, not in years, but in knowledge. The child who had once prayed to Anahita was gone. What remained was something harder, sharper, a survivor forged in the empire's furnace of holiness. And as the collector's laughter echoed down the corridors, Nara made a vow that no priest could sanctify. If the gods would not punish these men, she would. In the highest tier of the Persian court, where walls were painted with gold dust and secrets whispered softer than silk, Queen Atossa built her empire of whispers, the House of Shadows. To the world, it was a sanctuary of refinement, a place where the great king's guests were entertained by women of divine beauty and perfect manners. But beneath the perfume and poetry, it was a machine, one that turned pleasure into power and intimacy into espionage. Nara entered this house not as a slave anymore, but as a tool sharpened by obedience. Her silence, once forced, had become her greatest weapon. Atossa, veiled in white silk, watched her with eyes that missed nothing. "A woman who listens more than she speaks," the queen murmured, "is more dangerous than any soldier." And thus Nara was trained to serve in a new way, not through submission, but through knowing the right moments to break it. Each night, the House of Shadows bloomed like a poisonous flower. Foreign envoys reclined on jeweled cushions while courtesans danced, their bodies glistening with oil and ambition. The music masked the true rhythm of the place, the exchange of secrets between sighs, the quiet theft of knowledge from loosened tongues. Atossa's spies recorded every whisper, every confession murmured after lust. These women became the unseen architects of empire, weaving threads of deceit in candlelight. Yet, within that glittering cage, corruption spread like rot beneath a rose's petals. Those who climbed too high became dangerous. Those who refused to play the queen's game disappeared. One night, Nara found a courtesan's anklet lying near the reflecting pool, still warm from the body that once wore it. The girl's name was Mera. She had been Atossa's favorite only a day before. Now she was a rumor. Nara learned quickly. Affection in this palace was a blade wrapped in silk. The queen smiled with one hand while the other wrote death warrants. The women who survived were those who learned to mirror her grace, her cruelty, her control. In this theater of deceit, Nara began to adapt. She listened as noblemen boasted of campaigns and conspiracies. She memorized faces, voices, intentions, not for Atossa, but for herself. Every piece of information became a weapon she might one day use to escape. Then came Parvin, the eunuch who served as Atossa's attendant, delicate as glass yet sharp as a dagger's edge. He carried trays of wine with the precision of a priest, his movements so silent they seemed unreal. To the others he was invisible. To Nara, he was the only one who looked at her as if she were still human. Their connection grew not in words, but in glances shared across corridors heavy with perfume. In that world of deceit, the smallest truth became sacred. Atossa noticed. She always noticed. One evening, as she prepared for a royal feast, the queen traced her finger down Nara's arm. "You think I don't see," she said softly. but even shadows cast reflections. It was not a threat. It was a warning, one wrapped in the calm of a woman who had already destroyed countless lives. The feast that night was magnificent. Gold plates, fountains of wine, laughter that hid exhaustion. And yet, behind every smile, fear reigned supreme. The queen watched her courtesans dance, and her eyes glimmered with both pride and contempt. She had built perfection, but she knew perfection could not love her back. As torches flickered and the dancers bowed, Nara realized the truth. Atossa's brilliance was her curse. Her empire of whispers would one day devour itself. And in that moment, beneath the queen's calculating gaze, Nara understood. Survival in the House of Shadows required something darker than obedience. It required becoming a shadow herself. Parvin was neither man nor woman, a creation of the Empire's cruelty, sculpted in pain and silence. Once a shepherd's son from the Zagros foothills, he had been taken as tribute, castrated before his voice had even deepened. The priests had called it purification, a holy offering to serve the royal bloodline. But what they had truly created was a living instrument, loyal, voiceless, and unthreatening. Within the House of Shadows, Parvin moved like a ghost. His face was smooth, untouched by beard or desire, his body draped in the soft silks of the queen's attendants. To Atossa, he was useful, a vessel of absolute obedience. He poured her wine, carried her secrets, and whispered prayers during her sleepless nights. To everyone else, he was invisible, a fixture of the palace like the golden lamps or the painted walls. But Nara saw him. She noticed the tremor in his hands when the priests entered the queen's chambers. She saw how he flinched at the scent of burning myrrh, the same resin once used in the rites that had mutilated him. In him, she saw a reflection of her own captivity, carved differently, but just as deep. Their bond began in silence. A glance exchanged when no one was watching. A shared moment as they lit the queen's candles, both knowing that they served the same master fear. Parvin began slipping her fragments of knowledge, which guards were loyal, which doors remained unlocked during the festivals when Atossa retired to her baths. Each whisper was a thread in a quiet tapestry of rebellion neither dared to name. Yet the palace watched. The House of Shadows thrived on whispers, and one whisper too many could kill. Rumors spread that the queen's eunuch had grown fond of a courtesan. Some found it amusing, others blasphemous. But to Atossa, it was treason. She ruled by control and affection. Even the faintest was defiance. One evening, she summoned Parvin to her private chamber. The room smelled of pomegranate oil and smoke. "Do you dream?" she asked him, her voice soft as silk. He lowered his head. "Dreams are for those who sleep without guilt, my queen." She smiled faintly. "Then you are blessed, for you have none to confess." He left her chamber alive, but trembling. That night, Nara found him by the reflecting pool, his hands clenched around a silver cup, his breath unsteady. "She knows," he whispered. "She sees everything. If she ever doubts us, she will not hesitate." Nara placed her hand over his. "Then we give her reason to doubt nothing." Their plan was not yet rebellion, only survival. But survival has its own defiance. Together, they began to weave deceit around deceit, masking their alliance within the queen's own web. Nara reported false secrets, ones Parvin had crafted to please Atossa's hunger for control. Each lie fed the queen's illusion of mastery, even as her palace began to rot from within. Yet amidst the danger, a fragile tenderness grew. Parvin, who had been stripped of all manhood, found in Nara the first warmth of being seen. She never pitied him. She only listened, and that listening gave him back fragments of his stolen self. Still, love in such a place was impossible. It was a candle lit in a wind of knives. And when the queen looked upon them during a feast, her gaze cold and knowing, Parvin understood what must come. Freedom would never be granted. It would have to be taken, and it would demand blood. As night fell over Persepolis, the eunuch who had never known desire began to dream of fire. And in that dream, the empire began to burn. It began with a whisper, a prayer spoken too loud in the servants' quarters, a name carved into the wall of a washing room. In the house of shadows, where every sound was measured and every silence was watched, such things were dangerous. Yet something had begun to move among the slaves in attendance, something older than obedience, the need to breathe. Parvin lit the first spark. He had learned the palace's rhythms, the blind spots of guards, the hidden tunnels beneath the queen's baths that led toward the outer granaries. The plan was not conquest. It was escape or death, whichever came first. Freedom, he told Nara, is not for the living. It's for those who no longer fear dying. They chose the festival of Mithra, the night when the court would drown in wine and praise. The great king himself would sit upon the alabaster throne while dancers spun before him like living jewels. The queen would preside over the ceremonies, her spies busy attending to her vanity. And beneath that perfection, the servants would strike. Nara's role was to open the gates of the lower courtyards. She moved through the perfume-choked corridors as if still obedient, her face calm, her hands steady. Every step brought her closer to the forbidden storerooms, where oil, torches, and despair waited together. Parvin guided others through the tunnels, men and women who had nothing left to lose. Some carried knives stolen from kitchens, others merely stones. All carried faith in the fire to come. As the drums of celebration thundered above, the slaves lit their torches. The first flame caught on silk. The second licked at the cedar pillars. By the time the third reached the oil jars, Persepolis began to breathe fire. Screams pierced the music. Curtains of gold became sheets of flame. Courtesans ran, their jeweled veils melting into their skin. The king's guards stumbled drunk into chaos. For one moment, one impossible holy moment, the empire of pleasure burned with the heat of its own sins. Nara found herself amid the inferno, guiding others through smoke and terror. The air was thick with incense and blood. She saw Parvin dragging a wounded girl through the corridor, his white garments turning crimson. "This way," he shouted, the first time she had ever heard him raise his voice. They reached the tunnel's mouth, a stone arch half collapsed by heat. Behind them, the palace groaned as if alive. Statues cracked, and the painted ceilings rained ash like gray snow. Nara looked back once, at the house of shadows, her years of pain, her chains, her lost innocence, all dissolving into the flames. For the first time she smiled. But freedom is cruel. At dawn, the soldiers came, not drunk, not confused, but vengeful. The rebellion had been contained before it reached the outer gates. Those who fled through the tunnels were trapped between walls and fire. The king's decree was swift: let none who serve impurity live. Nara was found unconscious beside Parvin's body. He had shielded her from falling stone, his arm still outstretched toward the opening that never came. When she awoke, chains bound her wrists once more. The fires of Persepolis had been extinguished, the marble floors scrubbed clean. The courtesan halls were silent again, as if the rebellion had been only a dream. But the narrator's voice lingers. Empires can erase memory, not guilt. Beneath the restored perfection of Persepolis, the ashes of the slaves remained, a hidden scar beneath polished stone. And somewhere in the darkness of her cell, Nara whispered the words Parvin never got to finish. Freedom is not for the living. It's for those who will be remembered. When the fires of the rebellion were finally quenched, the great king ordered the marble halls of Persepolis scrubbed with milk and rosewater. He could not bear the smell of smoke, it reminded him of weakness. But the whispers that had burned with the slaves refused to die. The court spoke of curses, of unseen spirits haunting the queen's mirrors, of women's cries echoing through empty corridors. Darius the Great, ruler of nations and judge of men, decided the empire itself needed cleansing. He summoned the priests of Ahura Mazda and commanded a purification of the flesh. Every courtesan, every eunuch, every servant who had ever walked the halls of the House of Shadows was to be interrogated, weighed in piety, and marked according to guilt. The queen's former attendants, the most beautiful faces of the empire, were dragged before tribunals of holy men who knew no mercy. Their punishments were wrapped in ritual. Some were shaved bald and branded with the royal seal, iron pressed against skin until smoke rose like incense. Others were drowned in baths of perfumed water, washed of sign until their lungs filled with purity. The priests chanted, the king watched, and the empire applauded its own righteousness. Atossa herself presided over the transformation. Her House of Shadows, now renamed the Hall of Devotion, became a state-run institution, a place where every gesture of pleasure was sanctioned, every body catalogued and controlled. Desire was no longer sin. It was property of the crown. Nara was spared execution, though none could say why. Some whispered that the queen saw in her a mirror of her younger self. Others claimed the king demanded her as an example of cleansed devotion. Whatever the reason, she was sent not to the gallows, but to the king's private sanctum, the Chamber of Purity. It was a room of white stone and silence, perfumed with myrrh and the scent of death disguised as divinity. Here the king prayed, fasted, and purified himself after every act of judgment. Nara's role was to serve him, to wash his hands, to anoint his hair, to kneel as he spoke of order, faith, and destiny. Night after night, Darius would recite hymns to the god of light while his hands trembled over the basin. "The empire must be clean," he whispered. "The stain must be erased." Nara would pour scented water over his fingers, watching crimson swirls rise from beneath his nails, the residue of punishment that no ritual could cleanse. One night, the king commanded that ashes from the executed be mixed into the water, so the impure may serve in death what they defied in life, he said solemnly. The priests obeyed. As Nara poured the darkened water into the basin, she saw fragments floating, bits of bone, charred cloth, the dust of those who had once shared her captivity. The king plunged his hands into it, eyes closed in ecstasy, believing himself reborn. To him, it was purification. To her, it was desecration. When he was done, he lifted his cleansed hands and smiled faintly. "Now the empire is pure," he declared. But Nara saw the truth. Purity had devoured humanity. As she bowed before him, her face calm, her mind returned to the flames of the rebellion, to Parvin's final breath, to every soul consumed by the empire's hunger for perfection. The king's fingers still glistened with ash and blood. And in that reflection, the white marble, the perfumed smoke, the quiet madness, Nara understood. The empire would never end in war. It would end in worship. Centuries passed. The empire that had once burned with gold and glory fell silent beneath layers of wind and time. Persepolis, once the beating heart of kings, became nothing more than stone ribs jutting from the desert. The marble floors where slaves once crawled were buried beneath shifting sands. The echoes of music, of prayers, of screams, all turned to dust. But the earth remembers what men forget. In the summer of 1932, a team of archaeologists uncovered what they believed to be a royal annex beneath the ruins. They expected treasures, tablets, coins, relics of power. What they found instead was a corridor of charred rooms, their walls blackened by fire. Beneath collapsed beams lay hundreds of skeletons, small and delicate, arranged as if hiding from a storm that never ended. Among the ashes were fragments of mirrors, melted bangles, and the faint outline of painted murals depicting women offering wine to unseen gods. It was not a palace. It was the House of Shadows, reborn in ruin. The lead excavator, Dr. Varzi, recorded in his journal, These walls carry a silence I cannot name. It feels as though we are intruding upon grief. His team unearthed ivory combs carved with the symbol of Anahita, shards of golden cups, and a pendant engraved with a single name in Old Persian script, Nara. The pendant rested on the ribcage of a woman who had been found kneeling beside a basin, her hand still curved as if once holding a vessel. Around her lay traces of burned silk and tiny flecks of ash, remnants of ritual or punishment. Dr. Varzi noted the curious mixture of perfume residue and bone dust in the soil, an impossible combination that should not have survived 2,000 years. The air here, he wrote, smells faintly of roses. In the documentary's narration, the historian's voice lowers, calm, reverent, uneasy. The empire built its greatness upon beauty, he says, and beauty upon suffering. What we call civilization was often nothing more than cruelty polished to perfection. As the camera pans across the ruins, the desert wind rises, sifting through the ancient corridors. The faint outline of frescoes appears, women dancing, priests chanting, kings bathing their hands in golden basins. But under the sunlight, the colors seem reversed, the red of sacrifice where gold once shone, the gray of ashes beneath every curve of divine art. The queen's name, Atossa, survives in history books as a visionary ruler, mother of Xerxes, builder of the empire's might. But no chronicle speaks of her courtesans, of her spies, of the bodies traded for secrets. Their story survived only in dust, in the ghost of a name carved into gold, Nara. The narrator's tone softens. Perhaps she never escaped. Perhaps her rebellion died in the fire. Yet, even now, her name endures where the king's inscriptions crumble. Empires fall, memory remains. As the wind howls through the empty chambers, one of the cameras captures something strange, a faint shimmer on the marble floor, like the reflection of firelight where no flame burns. The air trembles, and for a heartbeat, it almost sounds like a whisper. Freedom is not for the living. It's for those who will be remembered. Then the desert is silent again. The documentary fades out over the ruins, a haunting image of Persepolis swallowed by twilight. The last words echo softly. History remembers the builders of empires, not the bones they built upon. But beneath every stone of glory lies a shadow. And sometimes that shadow has a name.